was a second-year medical student when I got the page. It was my roommate, and she said that there was some man outside our door. He was yelling that the CIA and police was after him, and he was yelling my name over and over and saying he was my father. And when she told me this, I had this familiar rush of panic feeling, but this was worse. This was the first time Dad had come 300 miles to find me, and I raced home and I took him to the Stanford emergency room where I was a medical student, hoping that none of my classmates would see us. Growing up, no one ever really talked to me about why Dad acted so strange so often. There was so much chaos, and yet there was so much silence. Dad would often come to my school, and he'd pace outside the window in the classrooms, and he'd yell out my name. And when this happened, I felt such shame. Well, that day in the emergency room, I knew Dad's schizophrenia was really bad, and his false beliefs, the delusions, were completely controlling his thinking. So I was shocked when the emergency room told me that Dad couldn't be hospitalized. We left, and I frantically looked all over for help, and nothing. Well, Dad finally went back to where he was living, but this kept happening, where he'd show up in a crisis, and I'd try to get help and care, and nothing. And I realized that if I was going to finish my medical training, I needed to disconnect from Dad, to hide from him, and I became unlisted in the phone book. I hated myself for doing it, and I just felt like there was no other way. It was so ironic that here I was finally learning how to help Dad, and I was abandoning him. Well, a few years later, I was in my medical residency, and I got really interested in documentary filmmaking. And I started to make some short documentaries, taking classes at night, and I was thinking about doing a bigger project, and something kept pulling at me, and that was Dad. He was doing better. He was in supportive housing, getting treatment, and I wanted to reconnect with him. And I did a lot of soul searching, and I decided that I would make the film that I was most afraid to make, and that was about Dad and me. There had been so much silence. Well, making the film was hard. I had to face a lot of hard emotions, like the shame that I had for Dad, to the point that I didn't invite him to my medical school graduation, and I didn't invite him to my wedding. And when Dad told me this on camera, I had to also face the guilt. Well, when the film was done, I was nervous. I didn't know what people would think about Dad, about me. But when audiences started watching the film, I transformed because I saw for the first time the power of a personal story to inspire compassion around mental illness. First, I experienced the compassion that I had for myself by coming forward with the things that I was most afraid of sharing. I accepted more about myself, and I healed. But then it was the compassion from audience members and for the whole family, but particularly for my dad. He was no longer the schizophrenic man agitated on the street corner, but they could see him for who he was, a former English graduate student at UC Berkeley, a person who wrote a novel. But the most critical thing that happened was that the compassion transformed into action. And people came forward with stories that they had kept hidden. Colleagues of mine in my medical practice, good friends even, who hadn't told me things before, from this place of emotion, now were sharing with me their experiences of mental illness. And then at screenings, people would stand up and share things, and then more stories happened. Stories, as you know, invite other stories. Well, after that experience of sharing my own story and seeing the power, I decided that I wanted to help others share their stories. And I was working in clinics for the poor as a general doctor. And I started to think a lot about mental illness and poverty, something that I had grown up with. And I started to film stories there in clinic. But I realized one day that I wanted to film the most hidden stories of all. And that's people living in the poor countries of the world. The WHO estimates that about 450 million people globally have some type of a mental disorder, the majority of them in developing countries. But we hear so little. If I heard anything at all, it was more about, how different we are. Like somehow mental illness and culture make it so that we could never understand mental illness in a different country. Well, when I went and I started filming, I quickly discovered the opposite was true, that we're much more similar than different. Take, for example, silence. Whether I was filming in China, India, Africa, it would take me weeks upon weeks to find anybody, any family, willing to come forward and share their mental illness experience with me, on or off camera. Take shame. One story that I finally was able to film in India, the father, a physician, he told me that it was just recently that he and his wife had told their extended family of their daughter's schizophrenia. And take poor access to mental health care. It's there and much worse. Just like it used to be in the United States, where we had all the mental health care that we did have in a few psychiatric hospitals, that's what it's like in these parts of the world. The idea of community mental health care just doesn't exist. In India, there's 2 psychiatrists for a city the size of Seattle. And if you visit the clinics throughout the country, the majority of them don't even have an antidepressant. I was filming in this independent treatment center when I met Selma and her mother. Selma had severe mental illness, and her mother told me that before finding this treatment center, she had looked everywhere to try to find treatment and couldn't. And Selma would often wander off into the neighborhood, and she would disturb the neighbors, so much so that they told Selma's mom that she should restrain her daughter. And the mom didn't know what else to do. And so she ended up buying a chain and attaching it to her daughter's ankle, and the other side to a cement block she had in the home. It's something that families had to resort to here 100 years ago as well, when there were no other treatment options. But what pulled me to this story wasn't the chain, it was the love. Selma's mom told me how it broke her heart to have to use the chain on her daughter, but at least she knew that she was safe at home and not wandering off. And Selma had a son, Abraham. And Abraham had lived with his mother with his chain on for 7 years. But now he was so happy. And he said to me that seeing his mom was just so fantastic now. And whenever we would run into any of his school friends, he would yell out to them, my mom, come meet my mom," even though his mom still had serious symptoms of mental illness. But when he said this, his pride was just so contagious. What I've discovered filming these stories and many others over a decade is how it is so hard for many people to come forward with these really intimate personal stories around mental illness. But that my role as a listener has been just as important as my role as a storyteller. And that while sometimes it's awkward to think of like what to ask and how to respond, I've learned that it's worth that discomfort, and that over time the people appreciate so much an audience, and that I can see the healing that happens. And the other thing that I discovered is that the idea that we're so much more different than similar is not only untrue, it's unjust. Over and over, and the research has shown it, I would see the same treatment services and options, same counseling techniques work in a village of India as it does in a clinic in Seattle. But so often, people don't get that treatment. It was in 2006 that I got the phone call. I was home editing, and this voice started talking to me. And as he did, I felt my entire being crash to the floor, and I started screaming. He told me that my dad, off his medicine and out of treatment, had gone into a severe mental illness crisis. And that Dad had packed up all of his things into 3 boxes. And at 3 a.m., he walked out onto a pier. Actually, it was the same pier he used to take me when I was a little girl. And he handed his wallet to a teenage couple. And before they knew what Dad was doing, Dad climbed up on the wood rail there, and he pushed himself over into the ocean. There's almost 1 million suicides that happen every year around the world. That's almost the size of San Francisco, gone every 12 months, perhaps into the ocean. And if it's a developing country, usually by ingesting pesticides, poison. There's an epidemic of silence around mental illness, and an epidemic of silence around suicide, and the epidemic of silence has to stop. So this is the point that I want to leave you here with today, is that each of us in this room has the power to make a difference. The first thing is we need the courage to share our stories. A half of us in this room in our lifetime will have a mental illness. It might be mild, it might be more severe. And all of us know a family member or a friend who's been affected. And even if we just share a little bit, the power to generate a lot of compassion and to generate a lot more stories is absolutely there. And the next thing is, we need to have the commitment to listen. That while it might be tricky to know exactly how to ask questions and what to say next, to see people heal in front of your eyes is transformative for both sides. And the third and final thing is that we need to have the creativity to think collaboratively, to share our stories and spread them widely. Let me give one example. for this past World Mental Health Day, I was thinking about how to use personal stories to better create a dialogue around global mental health. And so I decided to ask mental health organizations if they wanted to join me in a one-day screening of a documentary I made that included a lot of personal stories from all over the world. So I asked all these organizations from all over, and 140 of them, including the World Health Organization, joined me to create this global discussion. Organizations want personal stories because they know they inspire. But you don't have to be a filmmaker to help spread stories widely. There's a lot of organizations that have these online communities which are set up to do just that. There's National Alliance on Mental Illness, OK to Talk, Bring Change to Mind, just to name a few. And so I'm really confident that when we do these steps, we have the power to change the paradigm from silence to compassion, so that children won't feel alone, so that individuals won't feel shame, that families won't be disconnected, and that people here and all over the world will get the mental health care they deserve, mental health care that can make a world of difference. Thank you.